Agnes Winter's life was a conversation with ghosts. Not the spectral kind, but the ghosts of memory, emotion, and time, all captured in the delicate, complex language of scent. In her small house on Juniper Lane, a house steeped in the aromas of vetiver, ambergris, and 100 other mysteries, she was a perfumer, one of the last true noses of her generation. Her laboratory, a sun-drenched room lined with shelves of dark glass bottles, was her sanctuary. Here, she didn't mix chemicals, she composed olfactory poetry. Each bespoke fragrance she created was a portrait of its wearer, a story told in top notes, heart notes, and a lingering, soulful bass. Her late husband, Edward, a brilliant but unassuming research chemist, had always been the pragmatist, the one who managed the business side, allowing her to be the artist. You bottle memories, my dear, he used to say. It's a form of magic. Her children, however, had little patience for magic. Julian, her son, was the charismatic CEO of Aura, a rapidly growing skincare brand. His products were minimalist, clinical, and marketed with aggressive, scientific sounding jargon. They were all about bioavailable molecules and optimized dermal delivery. But to Agnes's discerning nose, they smelled of little more than sharp, synthetic chemicals and the faint, metallic scent of ambition. Her daughter, Isabel, and her husband, a ruthless property developer named Richard, moved in a world of glass towers and leveraged assets. They saw the quiet, tree-lined block of Juniper Lane not as a community, but as an underdeveloped parcel of land, a perfect location for their next luxury condominium project, the Apex. The conspiracy to dismantle Agnes's life was orchestrated with the chilling precision of a corporate takeover, all under the guise of love and concern. It began with a visit. Mother, Julian said, his handsome face a mask of practiced sincerity as he sat in her fragrant living room. Aura is launching a new legacy line. We want to honor Grandma Rose. We want to recreate her signature scent, the one you made for her. The scent he spoke of was Agnes's masterpiece. Rosewood and Rain, a complex, deeply personal fragrance built around a core of Bulgarian rose, cedarwood, and the elusive scent of petrichor, the smell of earth after a storm. The formula was her most guarded secret, a symphony of over 200 natural ingredients, written in her own coded shorthand in a leather-bound journal. It's just for us, Isabel added, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Agnes's arm. A tribute, so we can always have a piece of her and you with us. Her heart, foolish and maternal, swelled with love. She saw not the CEO and the developer, but the two small children who used to play amongst the rose bushes in her garden. For a week, she worked, carefully transcribing the complex, coded formula onto a clean sheet of paper. It felt like sharing a piece of her soul. She handed it to Julian, who folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. 2 weeks later, they returned. This time, their smiles were gone. In their place was a cold, professional resolve. Richard, the developer, did most of the talking. He laid out blueprints on her coffee table, covering a stack of antique perfume journals. Agnes, he began, dispensing with any pretense of familial warmth. As you know, we've acquired the majority of the properties on this block. Your house is the final piece of the puzzle for the Apex development. We are prepared to offer you a fair market price. This is my home, Agnes whispered, the scent of betrayal sharp and acrid in the air. It's an asset, Mother, Isabel said, her voice cool. And frankly, you can't manage it anymore. We've made arrangements for you. A beautiful place. It's one of our company's new investments, a luxury assisted living facility called Serenity Fields. It's state of the art. And your finances, Julian added, stepping in for the final blow. We'll manage them for you. The proceeds from the sale will go into a trust and will ensure you have a generous stipend. You won't have to worry about a thing. The fight was over before it began. They had her signature on a power of attorney from a previous medical scare. They had the perfume formula. And now they had her home. Her laboratory was dismantled, its precious contents, rare absolutes, vintage tinctures, a lifetime of work, were unceremoniously packed into boxes and put into a cheap storage unit. Serenity Fields was a monument to sterile, beige efficiency. It was a place where life was managed, not lived. The air smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. And, as she discovered from a talkative nurse, it was indeed owned by her son-in-law's development company. She was not a resident. She was an inmate in a prison her own children had built and profited from. Her world shrank to a single room with a sealed window. She watched on the small television as Julian launched Aura's new flagship product, Aura Legacy Number 1. He spoke in an interview of its revolutionary synthetic rose molecule and its scientifically engineered petrichor accord. He never mentioned her. He had stolen her soul and given it a serial number. The product was a massive success. Her life savings, the money from the sale of her home, was now the fuel for her children's ambitions. It funded the Apex development. It funded Aura's aggressive international expansion. She was a ghost, a silent, unwilling investor in the life that had replaced hers. 6 months into her silent, scentless existence, a letter arrived, forwarded from her old address. It was from a discreet, highly specialized law firm based in Geneva, Switzerland. It concerned the estate of her late husband, Edward Winter. A polite, multilingual lawyer named Mr. Dubois explained the situation over the phone. Mrs. Winter, he began, his voice calm and precise. Your late husband was a man of extraordinary foresight. The work he did for your company was only a small fraction of his true vocation. The story Mr. Dubois unspooled was from a world Agnes could barely imagine. Edward, her quiet, gentle husband, had been a pioneer in the field of molecular synthesis. In the 1980s, he had secretly developed and patented a series of synthetic polymer chains. These were not just any molecules. They were a revolutionary class of non-reactive compounds with unique filtration properties. He was decades ahead of his time, Mr. Dubois explained. The patents were considered commercially unviable. He placed them in a blind trust with our firm, with a single, unalterable instruction. The trust was to lie dormant, its assets untouched, until the moment you were no longer the legal resident of your home on Juniper Lane. He told me if Agnes ever loses her sanctuary, it means the wolves are at the door. This is the weapon I leave for her. Agnes gripped the phone, the cheap plastic cool against her skin. Mrs. Winter, for 30 years, those patents were worthless. But 5 years ago, a consortium of tech companies discovered that your husband's molecules were the only known substances capable of effectively filtering rare earth elements during the microchip manufacturing process. They are, to put it simply, the single most valuable and irreplaceable component in the production of every advanced semiconductor on the planet. The lawyer paused, letting the weight of his words settle across the thousands of miles. Upon the triggering of the clause 6 months ago, we initiated a global auction for the patent portfolio. The bidding was aggressive. After settling all international tariffs and our firm's commission, the final amount deposited into a new private bank account in your name is $451 million. The sterile, beige room did not spin. Instead, it became incredibly, sharply clear. The vague, muffled despair that had been her constant companion for months was burned away in an instant by a white-hot flame of pure, unadulterated clarity. The ghosts of bergamot and rose she had conversed with for 50 years fell silent, replaced by the cold, clean, and utterly logical spirit of her husband, the chemist. She was not an artist anymore. She was an alchemist. And she was about to turn her children's glittering world to lead. Mr. Dubois, Agnes said, her voice a whisper, but with a new, resonant timbre of command. I will need you to form a new global holding company for me. Its name will be Etheria Capital, and its first order of business will be acquisitions in the sectors of specialty chemical manufacturing and international logistics. The disappearance of Agnes Winter from Serenity Fields was a minor, unremarked event. For Julian and Isabel, it was a nuisance, another loose end in their otherwise flawless ascent. They assumed she had wandered off, a confused old woman. They filed a missing persons report for appearance's sake and moved on. In reality, Agnes was in Geneva, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the lake, the new, silent, and invisible chairwoman of Etheria Capital. Her transformation was absolute. The soft, artistic dreamer was gone, replaced by a cold, pragmatic strategist. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her directives, delivered in quiet, precise tones, were executed by a team of the most ruthless legal and financial minds in Europe. She had spent a lifetime composing with notes of jasmine and sandalwood. Now, she composed with leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers. Her targets were the twin pillars of her children's empires. Julian's company, Aura, was built on a foundation of exclusive supply chains. His revolutionary, synthetic molecules were produced by a single, highly specialized chemical plant in Germany. The unique, airless pumped glass bottles for his products were manufactured by a boutique firm in South Korea. His global distribution was handled by a single, high-end logistics company based out of Singapore. Within 4 months, Etheria Capital, through a series of complex, untraceable shell corporations, owned all three. Isabel and Richard's real estate empire, Apex Development, was a house of cards built on debt. Their primary lender, the institution that held the massive, risky construction loans for all their projects, was a mid-sized, aggressive investment bank in New York. And the critical zoning approvals for their flagship, Apex, condominium project, the one on her old land, were being pushed through the City Planning Commission by a powerful, well-connected lobbying firm. Within 6 months, Etheria Capital had acquired a controlling interest in the investment bank and had hired the lobbying firm on an exclusive, multi-million dollar retainer for international projects, effectively taking them off the board for any domestic work. The revenge was not a blitzkrieg, it was a siege, a slow, methodical strangulation. For Julian, the problems began as minor irritations, a shipment of his legacy no. One arrived in London with a subtle, unpleasant chemical undertone. A batch of the elegant glass bottles was rejected for microscopic flaws, halting his production line for 3 weeks. The Singapore logistics company suddenly doubled its rates for high-value cosmetic transport, citing new insurance protocols. His profit margins began to evaporate. His retail partners grew impatient. His brand, built on an image of flawless perfection, began to show cracks. For Isabel and Richard, the assault was more brutal. Their primary lender, under new risk management protocols from its new, unseen ownership, suddenly refused to extend their line of credit for the Apex project, demanding an immediate capital infusion they did not have. Simultaneously, their powerful lobbying firm inexplicably dropped them as a client, citing a conflict of interest. The City Planning Commission, no longer under pressure, began to raise legitimate concerns about the environmental impact and zoning variances for the Apex. Construction ground to a halt. Their empire, built on momentum and borrowed money, began to teeter on the verge of collapse. Agnes sat in her Geneva office, reading the daily reports. She saw the panicked emails Julian was sending to the German chemical plant, demanding answers. She read the transcripts of the furious, pleading voicemails Richard was leaving for the CEO of the New York bank. They were firing cannons at shadows, never knowing the hand that controlled them all was their mother's. The climax was set for the Future of Luxury Symposium, a global event where Julian was the keynote speaker. It was to be the crowning moment of his career, the unveiling of his company's new international branding. He stood on the massive stage, under the hot glare of the spotlights, a giant screen behind him displaying the sleek, minimalist Aura logo. He was halfway through his speech about disruptive innovation when the logo on the screen behind him flickered. It dissolved, reforming into the elegant, chemical structure logo of Etheria Capital. A murmur went through the audience of 1,000 industry leaders. Julian froze, his words dying in his throat. Then, a woman's voice, calm, clear, and amplified through the auditorium's sound system, filled the silence. Disruption, the voice said, is a fascinating concept. From the wings, Agnes Winter walked onto the stage. She was not the soft, floral-scented woman they had discarded. She was a vision of quiet, immense power, dressed in a simple, exquisitely tailored gray suit. She walked to the center of the stage, taking the microphone from her son's limp hand. She looked out at the stunned audience, her gaze sweeping over them before finally settling on Julian, who stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost. My son speaks of innovation, Agnes continued, her voice as smooth and cool as glass. But true innovation is not about marketing. It is about creation. My late husband, for example, created the molecules that are the foundation of every major semiconductor in the world. A small, unglamorous but essential act of genius. She turned to her son. You, on the other hand, took a work of art, a memory I bottled for my own mother, and you gave it a serial number. You stole a soul and called it a bioavailable molecule. She looked back at the audience. As of this morning, Etheria Capital, of which I am the founder and sole owner, has completed its acquisition of Aura's primary chemical supplier, its packaging manufacturer, and its global logistics partner. In short, we own every single component of my son's disruptive business. A collective gasp went through the room. Julian looked as if he had been turned to stone. Aura will be restructured, Agnes stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Its legacy line will be discontinued immediately. All profits from its past sales will be redirected to a new foundation I am establishing, the Edward Winter Institute for Olfactive Research, a place for true alchemists. She placed the microphone back on its stand. Her work was done. She looked at her son one last time at the ruins of his ambition and felt a profound and final sense of peace. The debt had been paid. The formula had been reclaimed. Without another word, she walked off the stage, leaving Julian standing alone in the spotlight, under the logo of the company that had just consumed his entire world. Her revenge was complete, as silent, as complex, and as utterly devastating as the base notes of a perfume, lingering in the air long after she had gone. The fallout from the symposium was catastrophic and immediate. Julian's public humiliation became the stuff of industry legend, a viral cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the globe. He was a corporate Icarus whose wings, it turned out, had been owned by his mother all along. Aura, the brand he had built into a sleek, minimalist empire, was swiftly and efficiently dismantled by Etheria Capital's restructuring team. He was formally terminated, his shares rendered worthless, and forced to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that effectively erased him from his own story. He was left with nothing but a fraction of his former wealth and the ashes of his reputation. Isabel and Richard's demise was less public, but no less brutal. With their credit lines frozen and their political capital gone, the Apex project collapsed into a black hole of debt and litigation. They were forced into a humiliating bankruptcy, a messy, public affair that stripped them of every asset: the glass house, the luxury cars, the carefully curated life. Richard, the ruthless developer, was ill equipped for a world where he held no leverage. His bluster and threats were met with the cold, impenetrable walls of Etheria's legal team. He and Isabel were left with less than Julian. They were left with a mountain of personal debt that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The siblings, once united in their conspiracy, were now fractured by their shared failure. They did not come together for support. Instead, they retreated to opposite ends of the country, each blaming the other, and both consumed by a burning, impotent rage towards the quiet, ghost-like mother who had outplayed them at every turn. For Agnes, victory was a quiet, sterile landscape. She had won. She had achieved a justice so complete, so total that it left a void in its wake. She had proven her power, reclaimed her legacy, and secured her husband's. She established the Edward Winter Institute for Olfactive Research in a beautiful, state-of-the-art facility in the French city of Grasse, the historical heart of perfumery. It became a haven for a new generation of noses, a place where the art and science of scent could flourish, free from the crass demands of marketing and commerce. She was a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, a titan. But she was also profoundly, achingly alone. Her children were gone, excised from her life like a discordant note from a perfect formula. And in the quiet of her Geneva apartment, surrounded by a world of beauty and success, she began to wonder what exactly she had won. The story could have ended there. But chemistry, as her husband had taught her, is the science of transformation. And sometimes, the most volatile reactions occur only after the initial explosion has settled. 3 years after the symposium, Agnes received a package. It was a small, plain cardboard box with a postmark from a remote, dusty town in New Mexico. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry desert grass, was a small, crudely made glass bottle. It was sealed with a simple cork. There was no label. Her first instinct, the instinct of C.M. Thorne, was to have it destroyed, assuming it was a pathetic, perhaps even dangerous, gesture from one of her children. But the instinct of Agnes Winter, the perfumer, won out. She took the bottle into her private laboratory, her hands trembling slightly for the first time in years. She carefully uncorked it and placed a single drop onto a testing strip. She raised it to her nose. The scent was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was not a perfume. It was a raw, brutal, and breathtakingly honest accord. The top note was the smell of dry, sun-baked creosote bush and desert dust, a scent of exile and loneliness. The heart was a complex, almost discordant blend of cheap, synthetic soap, the scent of a low-wage job, mingled with the unmistakable, metallic tang of fear and stale coffee from 1,000 sleepless nights. It was the scent of failure. But then, beneath it all, came the base. It was a quiet, tenacious, and incredibly beautiful note of pure, unadulterated cedarwood, the scent of resilience, the scent of something that had been stripped bare but refused to break. It was the smell of a tree growing in the desert, its roots digging deep into the hard, unforgiving earth. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was a self-portrait, painted in scent. It could only have come from Julian. For the first time since she had received Mr. Dubois' phone call, Agnes wept. She wept for her son, for the arrogant boy who had become a man in the crucible of his own making. She wept for her husband, who had understood the chemistry of both molecules and men. And she wept for herself, for the cold, hard shell she had built around her own heart. Through her network, she found him. Julian was working under a different name as a lab technician in a small, independent chemical supply company in the New Mexico desert. He was not a CEO. He was not a visionary. He was a man who worked with his hands, who understood the quiet dignity of a job well done. He had taken his brilliant, broken mind and applied it not to marketing, but to the simple, honest work of chemistry. He had, in his own way, found his way back to his father. Agnes did not call. She did not write. She got on a plane. The reunion was not in a boardroom or a sterile living room. It was in a dusty, sun-bleached parking lot outside his workplace. He saw her get out of the town car, and his face, now leaner and etched with lines of hardship, registered not shock or fear, but a deep, weary recognition. They did not embrace. They stood a few feet apart, the dry desert wind whispering between them. The cedar wood, Agnes said, her voice soft, it was a masterful extraction. How did you achieve it without fracturing the sesquiterpenes? Julian looked at his mother, at this incredible, formidable woman who had crossed an ocean to ask him a question about chemistry. And in that question, he heard everything she could not say. He heard acknowledgement. He heard respect. He heard the faint, tentative top note of forgiveness. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. I remembered something Dad taught me about fractional distillation under a low vacuum, he said. It took me 6 months to get it right. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the shared language of their craft bridging the vast, silent chasm of their past. I have been thinking, Agnes said, her voice careful. The Institute in Grass has a new research wing. We are exploring the synthesis of rare, sustainably sourced aromaticals. The work requires a director with a unique understanding of both the artistic and the scientific. It requires a chemist with the soul of a perfumer. It was not an offer of a job, it was an offer of a home. A chance to take the broken pieces of his life and his talent and synthesize them into something whole and new. Julian looked past his mother, towards the vast, endless expanse of the desert horizon. He had come here to disappear, to be punished. He had found a quiet, simple life, a life of penance. The thought of returning to the world of ambition and expectation, even a world of his mother's making, was terrifying. But he also saw the truth. His work here was an echo of his father's. His mother's work was the legacy of her soul. To combine them, that was not just a career, that was a purpose, that was alchemy. I would need to give my current employer 2 weeks' notice, he said, his voice steady. The story of Isabel was quieter, and in many ways, sadder. Agnes's vast network found her living in a drab, suburban town, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Richard had left her years ago, unable to cope with a life devoid of status and wealth. Isabel lived alone, in a small, neat apartment, her life a monotonous routine of work and solitude. She had paid off her debts. She had survived, but she had never learned how to live. She had no passion, no art, no craft to anchor her. Agnes did not go to her. An act of restoration requires a foundation to build upon, and she did not know if Isabel had one. Instead, she made a phone call. A week later, a large, flat package arrived at Isabel's apartment. Inside was a framed architectural drawing, a beautiful hand-drafted rendering. It was a preliminary sketch of the Edward Winter Institute's new sensory library, a building designed to house not books, but an archive of 10,000 different scents, a place for research and public experience. Tucked into the corner of the package was a simple, handwritten note from Agnes. A building is more than an asset, it read. It can be a vessel for memory, a home for an idea. This is the last project I will build. The current project manager is competent, but he has no vision. The project lacks a soul. I thought of you. It was not a job offer. It was a question. It was a test. It was a chance for Isabel to take her ambition, her eye for design, her understanding of how spaces affect people, and apply it to building something that wasn't about profit, but about legacy. For a full week, the drawing sat on Isabel's dining room table. She looked at it every day, torn between the terrifying prospect of re-engaging with her mother's world and the suffocating gray of her current existence. She looked at the elegant lines of the building and saw not just a library, but a chance to build a second act for her own life. On the 8th day, she picked up the phone and made her first call, not to her mother, but to a renowned landscape architect she had once known, to ask a question about the visitor flow from the gardens into the main atrium. She had, in her own way, accepted the job. In the end, Agnes's family was not so much rebuilt as it was recomposed. It was a new formula, with the same base ingredients, but arranged in a new, more complex, and ultimately more harmonious structure. Julian brought his father's scientific rigor to his mother's artistic vision, creating scents that were both beautiful and revolutionary. Isabel channeled her ambition into creating a space that would be a gift to the world, a monument to the very things she had once scorned. Agnes Winter spent her final years not in a boardroom, but where she had always belonged, in the laboratory, surrounded by the ghosts of scent. But she was no longer alone. She was flanked by her children, two brilliant, damaged, and finally whole individuals. They were her final, most complex, and most beautiful composition. A fragrance with bitter top notes of betrayal, a complex heart of loss and retribution, and a long, lingering base of redemption, as tenacious and as beautiful as cedarwood growing in the desert. The Edward Winter Institute for Olfactive Research was not merely a building. It was a living poem, a quiet global epicenter for an art form that had for too long been relegated to the back rooms of commerce. Its reputation was stellar, built not on marketing, but on the purity of its mission and the revolutionary nature of the work being done within its walls. Julian, now in his late 40s, was the Institute's director of research and synthesis. He had, over 5 years, undergone a profound and quiet transformation. The sharp, restless energy of the CEO had been alchemized into the patient, focused intensity of a master chemist. He had taken his father's foundational patents and, with his mother's artistic guidance, pushed them into new, breathtaking territories. They had pioneered a new class of living accords, complex synthetic molecules that mimicked not just a single scent, but an entire environment, evolving on the skin over time. One of their creations, Kyoto Garden, didn't just smell of cherry blossoms. It smelled of damp stone after a spring rain, of koi ponds and ancient cedar wood, a scent that told a story over a period of 12 hours. It was a scientific and artistic achievement that had sent shockwaves through the industry. He found a deep, monastic peace in his work. His life was a conversation between his father's logic and his mother's intuition. He had not sought fame or wealth, but he had found something far more valuable, a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer stealing a legacy, he was actively, brilliantly building one. Isabel's journey had been quieter, but no less transformative. She had accepted her mother's silent challenge and taken on the role of project director for the sensory library. The project became her obsession, her penance, and ultimately her salvation. She threw every ounce of her ambition, her meticulous eye for detail, and her innate understanding of space into its creation. She did not just manage the construction, she lived and breathed it. She fought with architects over the quality of light in the reading rooms. She spent weeks with acoustic engineers to ensure the scent archives had a perfect, meditative silence. She commissioned artists from around the world to create installations that translated scent into visual and tactile experiences. She discovered a part of herself she never knew existed, a genuine, passionate creator. Her work was not about creating a facade of luxury for a wealthy few, but about building a beautiful, accessible, and deeply human space for everyone. She was not the cold, calculating developer's wife anymore. She was a builder, a patron, a woman who understood that the true value of a building was not in its market price, but in the experiences it held for the people within it. The sensory library, upon its completion, was hailed by critics not as a building, but as a masterpiece of experiential architecture. It was, in every sense, her life's work. Their relationship with Agnes was a delicate, complex accord, one that had taken years to mature. There had been no single moment of tearful reconciliation. The wounds were too deep for such simple remedies. Instead, their healing had been a slow, incremental process, built on the sturdy foundation of their shared work. Their weekly meetings were not family dinners, they were project reviews. They would gather in Agnes's private laboratory, a space that was both a state-of-the-art research facility and a deeply personal sanctuary. Julian would present his latest molecular structures. Isabel would unroll blueprints for a new exhibition wing. Agnes would listen, her discerning nose and sharp mind evaluating every detail. Their conversations were about chemistry, about architecture, about art. But beneath the surface of the professional discourse, a new kind of family was being forged, one built not on assumption and obligation, but on a deep, hard-won mutual respect. The turning point, the moment the final, crucial base note of their new relationship settled into place, came on the 5th anniversary of the Institute's founding. To commemorate the day, Agnes had decided to finally create a new, official perfume for the institute itself, a signature scent that would encapsulate its entire philosophy. She did not, however, create it alone. For the first time, she invited her children to collaborate. The process was long and arduous. For 6 months, the three of them spent their evenings in the lab, surrounded by thousands of vials of raw materials. It was a delicate, often tense dance. Agnes, the classical master, favored the rich, complex naturals. Julian, the modernist, argued for the clean, precise, and sustainable synthetics he had developed. Isabel, the architect, was concerned not just with the scent itself, but with the space it created around the wearer, the emotional environment it built. They argued over a single molecule for a week. A specific strain of Haitian vetiver, which Agnes adored for its smoky, earthy complexity, Julian found too unpredictable and sought to replicate and improve it with a synthetic version. You can't improve the earth, Julian, Agnes said, her voice sharp. You can only listen to it. And you can't build a future by relying solely on the methods of the past, he retorted, his own passion flaring. This is what Dad understood. We can honor nature by finding a way to create its beauty without depleting it. Isabel, listening to them, stepped in. It's not an either-or, she said, her voice calm and clear. It's a both-and. The building works because the cold, modern glass is supported by the warmth of the old stone. The scent needs both. It needs the soul of the natural and the clarity of the synthetic. It needs its history and its future. It was a breakthrough. Working together, they created a fragrance that was a perfect, harmonious fusion of their three sensibilities. It had the rich, soulful depth of Agnes's naturals, the brilliant, clean structure of Julian's synthetics, and the sense of profound, peaceful space that Isabel had championed. They decided to call it Sanctuary. On the evening of the anniversary celebration, just before the guests arrived, the three of them stood alone in the main atrium of the sensory library, Isabel's masterpiece. A single, atomized spray of Sanctuary was diffused into the air, filling the vast, quiet space. Agnes looked at her children, not as the ambitious, damaged people who had betrayed her, but as the brilliant, resilient collaborators who stood beside her. She saw her husband's keen, scientific mind reflected in her son's eyes. She saw her own artistic soul, reborn and reshaped in her daughter's confident posture. Your father, Agnes began, her voice soft, catching slightly in her throat. He believed that the perfect formula was not one where nothing more could be added, but one where nothing more could be taken away. She looked around the beautiful, soaring space, at the life's work that surrounded them. He was wrong, she said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. The perfect formula is one that leaves room to grow. In that moment, the last ghost of the past finally dissolved. The story of their family was no longer a story of betrayal and revenge. It had become a story of alchemy. They had taken the lead of their broken relationships, their greed, their pain, and through a long, arduous process of fire, pressure, and purification, they had transformed it into gold. Julian reached out and gently took his mother's hand. Isabel placed her hand over both of theirs. The three of them stood in silence for a long moment, a trinity of creators, bound together by a shared legacy and the beautiful, complex scent of forgiveness. The accord was finally complete. The world knew the Edward Winter Institute as a quiet miracle. It had become what Agnes had only dared to dream, a global sanctuary for the art and science of scent, a place where commerce bowed to creation. Its signature fragrance, Sanctuary, was not a commercial product sold in department stores, but a scent that could only be experienced within the walls of the sensory library. It was a pilgrimage for perfumers, artists, and anyone seeking a moment of profound, olfactory peace. Julian was no longer just the director of research. He was a globally respected authority in his own right, a true heir to his father's genius. He had pioneered a field he called chronoperfumery, creating scents that were not static, but were molecularly engineered to evolve in complex, narrative arcs over 24 hours. His work was less about smelling good and more about experiencing a story. He was a quiet, intensely focused man who found his joy not in accolades, but in the silent, elegant logic of a perfectly balanced formula. The restless ghost of his ambition had been laid to rest, replaced by the profound satisfaction of a master craftsman. He had, in every sense of the word, found the right chemistry for his own soul. Isabel, too, had found her true calling. As the permanent director of the Sensory Library and its expanding global programs, she had discovered that her talent was not just for building structures, but for building bridges. between art and the public, between different cultures, between the past and the future. The library had become an architectural icon and a deeply beloved public space. She was a formidable, respected figure in the world of arts and architecture, known for her uncompromising vision and her deep understanding of how physical space shapes human experience. The brittle, insecure social climber was a distant memory, a ghost from a former life. She had learned to build on a foundation of substance, not sand. Their family was not rebuilt, it was newly composed. The weekly project meetings had, over years, softened into something that resembled family dinners. The conversations were still centered around their work, but now they were laced with an easy warmth, with shared jokes and a deep, unspoken understanding. They were a team, a triumvirate of creators, each a master of their own domain, yet inextricably linked. The respect they shared was the mortar that held their new life together. It was a quiet, functional, and deeply respectful peace. But the past, Agnes knew, is never truly gone. It is merely a bass note, a scent that lingers long after the initial impression has faded, shaping the entire composition in ways one can barely perceive. The final test of their new foundation arrived not as a crisis, but as an honor. The Sensory Library was nominated for the Pritzker Prize, the highest and most prestigious award in the world of architecture, often called the Nobel Prize for Architects. It was a staggering achievement, a testament to Isabel's vision and the entire team's work. The nomination brought a wave of international press and intense, global scrutiny. And with that scrutiny came the journalists. Not just architectural critics, but investigative reporters, drawn to the story of this mysterious, privately funded institution and the reclusive family behind it. A particularly tenacious reporter from a major London newspaper, a woman named Evelyn Reed, began to dig. She was known for her profiles, which were less about buildings and more about the complex, often messy human stories of their creators. The fragile peace of their quiet, insulated world was threatened. The story of their family, the betrayal, the ruin, the cold, systematic revenge, was a secret they had never spoken of, a toxic core sealed away in the past. If that story were to come out, it could tarnish everything they had built. It could reframe the narrative from one of philanthropic genius to one of a bitter, vengeful family feud. The crisis came to a head in Agnes's laboratory. She had summoned both Julian and Isabel. The air was thick with a tension they hadn't felt in years. On the table between them lay a copy of Evelyn Reed's latest article on a different subject, a brilliantly written and mercilessly insightful piece. An email from Mr. Dubois lay beside it, confirming that Miss Reed had formally requested an in-depth, on-the-record interview with all three of them. Isabel was pale, her hands tightly clasped. "We have to refuse," she said, her voice tight with a familiar old fear. "We issue a simple no comment. We let the work speak for itself. If this story comes out, it will taint the library. It will become the only thing people talk about. My work, our work, will be reduced to a footnote in a sordid family drama." Julian, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Refusing to comment will only fuel her speculation, Isabel. It implies we have something to hide, and we do. She'll dig, she'll find the bankruptcy records, she'll talk to old employees. We can't contain this. The best we can do is minimize the damage, give her a curated, sanitized version of the story. We focus on the reconciliation, we frame it as a misunderstanding." Agnes listened, her eyes closed, her fingers steepled before her lips. She heard the echo of her children's old selves in their panic. Isabel, terrified of her image being tarnished. Julian, trying to manage and control a narrative. Finally, she opened her eyes. They were clear, calm, and held a profound, unshakable certainty. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. The single word cut through the tension in the room. "We will not hide, we will not lie, and we will not offer a sanitized version of the truth. We will give her the interview. And we will tell her everything." Julian and Isabel stared at her aghast. "Mother, have you lost your mind?" Julian said, his professional composure cracking. "You want to hand-deliver the weapon that will destroy our reputation?" "Our reputation," Agnes replied, her gaze moving from her son to her daughter, "is built on a lie of omission. We have built beautiful, honest things. This institute, that library. But we, as a family, are living in a beautiful, dishonest house. And a house built on a weak foundation will, eventually, collapse." She stood and walked to the wall of her laboratory, where a single, massive board was covered in hundreds of tiny vials of raw materials, a perfumer's palette. "For years," she said, her back to them, "I have been trying to create one last fragrance. A personal one, I call it Etheria. after the company I founded to enact my revenge. But it has always been flawed. It is cold. It lacks a heart. It is technically perfect but emotionally empty because it is dishonest. It tells the story of the revenge but not the story of the cost. It does not speak of the shame or the loneliness or the long, difficult road back. She turned to face them, her eyes shining with a fierce, brilliant light. Our work, our true work, is alchemy. It is about taking raw, sometimes ugly materials and transforming them into something of value. We have done it with molecules. We have done it with buildings. Now, we must do it with the truth. Our story in its entirety, the betrayal, the cruelty, my cold and absolute revenge, your long and difficult atonement. That is the most complex formula we have ever worked with. And we will not hide it. We will make it the foundation of everything. It was the most terrifying and courageous directive she had ever given. It was an act of radical honesty, a final, complete rejection of the world of images and spin that her children had once worshipped. The interview with Evelyn Reed took place a week later. It was not held in a boardroom, but in the quiet, sun-drenched living room of Agnes's original home on Juniper Lane, the home she had transformed into the Mayfield house in the previous story's draft, but which in this reality she had kept as her private residence, a quiet anchor to her past. For 2 full days, they talked. They did not spare themselves. Agnes described the cold, methodical precision of her revenge. Julian spoke of the profound humiliation of his failure and the slow process of finding purpose in his father's craft. Isabel, in the most difficult testimony of all, spoke with raw, unsparing honesty about the hollow ambition and deep-seated insecurity that had driven her to betray her own mother. Evelyn Reed listened, her pen flying across her notepad. She had come expecting to uncover a secret, to expose a hypocrisy, but she found something far more powerful. A story of profound, brutal, and ultimately beautiful human transformation. Her article, when it was published, was a masterpiece. It was not an exposé. It was a multi-page feature titled, The Alchemists of Juniper Lane. It did not shy away from the ugly details, but it framed them not as a scandal, but as the necessary, volatile chemical reaction that had led to the creation of something extraordinary. It was a story about how the deepest wounds can sometimes lead to the most profound art. It was a story about redemption. The article did not tarnish their reputation. It cemented it. It transformed them from a family of mysterious, wealthy philanthropists into complex, relatable human beings. It gave their work a depth and a soul that no marketing campaign ever could. On the evening of the Pritzker Prize ceremony, held in a magnificent hall in Paris, the three of them sat together. When the announcer called Isabel's name, she walked to the stage, not as a terrified woman hiding a secret, but as a confident artist owning her entire story. In her acceptance speech, she spoke of architecture, of light and space, but then she looked directly at her mother and brother in the front row. A building like a life, she said, her voice clear and steady, is not defined by its flawless facade. It is defined by the strength of its foundation. My foundation was once weak, built on ego and fear. Today, it is strong because it was rebuilt, piece by painful piece, on a foundation of truth. I share this prize with my family, the co-architects of my reconstruction. Thank you. Later that night, back in their hotel suite, the heavy, prestigious medal sat on the mantelpiece, gleaming in the soft light. The past was no longer a secret to be guarded, but a story that had been told, a ghost that had been laid to rest. Agnes looked at her children, truly seeing them not as extensions of herself or her past, but as the remarkable, independent individuals they had become. I believe, she said, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips, that I can finally finish my formula. When they returned to grass, she led them into her lab. She took a new, empty bottle. She began to compose, but this time, she did not work alone. Julian, with his scientific precision, suggested a synthetic molecule that would lift and brighten the heart notes. Isabel, with her architect's eye, described a scent of clean, open space, which Agnes translated into a rare ozonic accord. And Agnes herself added the final, crucial ingredient, a single, tiny drop of the original rosewood and rain, the scent of her own history, the soul she had once thought stolen. The result was Etheria. It was a masterpiece. It opened with the sharp, almost bitter green notes of their painful past, evolved into a complex, beautiful heart of florals and woods representing their individual journeys, and settled into a warm, luminous, and incredibly peaceful base that smelled of forgiveness, of homecoming, of a sanctuary finally, truly earned. It was the scent of their story, and it was beautiful. The Pritzker Prize was not an ending, but a new beginning. It solidified the institute's and the sensory library's place on the world stage, transforming them from a niche passion project into a global cultural institution. The story of the Winter family, once a source of deep shame, had become an intrinsic part of their legend, a modern fable of redemption that drew not only tourists and scholars, but also those seeking their own second chances. Life settled into a new, harmonious rhythm. It was a rhythm of creation. Julian, now universally hailed as a visionary, continued to push the boundaries of olfactive science. Isabel, having cemented her architectural legacy, discovered a new passion in curating the library's increasingly complex and interactive exhibitions, finding new ways to tell stories through scent and space. Agnes, having finally composed her magnum opus, Ethuria, did not retire. Instead, she returned to her first love, teaching. She took on a small, select group of prodigiously talented young perfumers, mentoring them with the same fierce, unwavering honesty that had remade her own children. Their family was no longer a fragile alliance. It was a functioning, collaborative partnership. The weekly meetings continued, but they were now filled with an easy, confident warmth. They were a triumvirate, each a sovereign in their own domain, but united by a shared purpose that was larger than any one of them. The ghosts of their past had been acknowledged, named, and finally laid to rest. Or so they thought. The ghost who returned was not a memory, but a man of flesh and blood. His name was Richard Thorne, Isabel's ex-husband. He did not appear with threats or demands. He appeared as a news story. A small, tragic article buried in the business section of an international newspaper. Thorne, once a titan of property development, a man who moved mountains of concrete and steel with other people's money, had been found dead in a cheap hotel room in Macau. The official cause was a heart attack, but the article hinted at a darker story. Overwhelming gambling debts, ties to organized crime, a life that had spiraled out of control after his spectacular bankruptcy. He had died broke, alone, and forgotten. The news arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Isabel read the article on her tablet, her hand trembling so slightly it was almost imperceptible. She felt a strange, hollow echo in her chest, not grief, but the phantom limb pain of a life she had long since amputated. He was a stranger, a ghost from a book she had already closed. She took a deep breath, filed the information away, and went to work. But the past is never so easily dismissed. A week later, a young woman arrived at the Institute. She was in her early 20s, with Richard's sharp, intelligent eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw that was painfully familiar to Isabel. Her name was Maya Thorne. She was Richard's daughter from his first marriage, a daughter he had rarely spoken of, a part of a past he had tried to erase. She did not ask for money. She did not make accusations. She stood in the soaring, magnificent atrium of the sensory library, Isabel's masterpiece, and made a simple, devastating request. My father's will, Maya began, her voice steady but laced with a grief that was raw and real, was a joke. He had nothing left but debts, except for one thing. He left me the contents of a storage unit in New Jersey. She slid a photograph across the reception desk. It was a picture of a single, large, climate-controlled storage locker, filled to the ceiling with sealed, numbered crates. He told me in a letter that this was his real legacy, Maya continued, her eyes locking onto Isabel's. It's not art or furniture, it's a complete archive. Every blueprint, every contract, every legal document, every private email from his entire 30-year career, including the entire, unredacted history of Apex development and its collapse. He called it his scorched earth insurance policy. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating, an archive. A complete, unvarnished history of Richard's often brutal, legally questionable, and ruthless business practices. Practices in which Isabel, as his partner and wife, had been deeply complicit. While she had never engaged in illegalities herself, she had been the beautiful, smiling face of a business that had cut corners, bullied smaller competitors, and operated in the grayest areas of corporate law. The Pritzker Prize had celebrated her as a visionary artist. This archive threatened to expose her as a predator. What do you want? Isabel asked, her voice a dry whisper. I want to understand, Maya said, her gaze sweeping around the magnificent library. I read the article about you, about your family, this story of redemption. But the man who built this is not the father I knew. The man I knew was a monster. He destroyed my mother. He abandoned me. And then he came here and built this temple to art and integrity with you. It doesn't make sense. I want to know who my father really was. And I think the answers are in those boxes. It was a brilliant, devastatingly effective trap. If Isabel and the family refused to cooperate, Maya would assume they had something to hide and could leak the archive to the press, igniting a scandal that would dwarf the old family drama. If they agreed to help her, they would be forced to personally guide her through the toxic wasteland of their own past, unearthing every ugly secret, every compromised decision. The family convened that night in Agnes's laboratory. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the ozone of an approaching storm. For the first time in years, the old fear was back. "This is blackmail," Julian stated, his voice tight and clinical. "She's using the threat of public exposure to extort us. We need to get ahead of this. Our legal team can file an injunction, tie up the archive in probate court for years." Isabel stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "And what will that look like, Julian?" The celebrated alchemists of Juniper Lane, using their immense wealth to legally silence a grieving daughter who just wants to understand her father. The press would crucify us. She hasn't asked for a dime, she's asked for the truth. And we, of all people, have built our new lives on the claim of radical honesty. The bitter irony was not lost on any of them. Their greatest strength, their public story of redemption, had just become their greatest vulnerability. Agnes, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. "This is not about the press," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "This is not about our reputation. This is a ghost. A ghost of your making, Isabel. Richard was your partner. His actions were your actions. We cannot build a future on a foundation that is only partially honest. We told the world the story of our family's redemption, but we only told half of the story. We never spoke of the lives that were collateral damage in your old one." She turned to Isabel, her eyes not with judgment, but with a deep, sorrowful clarity. "This young woman is not an enemy. She is a loose thread. She is a part of the story we conveniently left out. And a story with a missing thread will, eventually, unravel completely." "What do you want me to do?" Isabel whispered, her voice breaking. "Walk her through every ugly decision we ever made. Show her how we squeezed out small landowners for the Apex project. Show her the life I helped him build on the ruins of her own family." "Yes," Agnes said simply. "That is exactly what you will do. You will not delegate this to a lawyer. You will not send an assistant. You will go to New Jersey. You will open those boxes with her. You will answer every one of her questions with the same unsparing honesty you showed to Evelyn Reed. And you will not defend your past actions. You will only explain them. You will, for the first time, take full, public ownership of the person you once were." It was a terrifying prospect. It was an act of complete and total surrender, a willing walk into the fire of a past she had thought long buried. "You won't go alone," Julian said, his voice firm. He looked at his sister, and in his eyes there was not the pragmatic coldness of a CEO, but the steady, unwavering loyalty of a brother. "This is not just your ghost, Isabel. We built our new lives together. We will face this together." The following week, the three of them, Agnes, Julian, and Isabel, flew to New Jersey. They met Maya at the storage facility, a vast, soulless place under the gray eastern sky. The moment the heavy locker door rolled up, revealing the wall of neatly stacked crates, the weight of the past became a physical presence. For the next 2 weeks, in the cold, dusty confines of that storage unit, they did not just open boxes, they performed an autopsy on a life. It was more brutal than any of them could have imagined. There were contracts that showed Richard strong-arming families out of their homes. There were private emails, cold and cruel, celebrating the failure of a competitor. And there, in a box marked personal, were letters from a young Maya, begging her father to come to her school play, letters that had clearly never been answered. Isabel did not flinch. With a courage she never knew she possessed, she walked Maya through every document. She explained the context, the pressure, the toxic ambition that had driven them. She did not make excuses. She owned her complicity, her willful blindness, her hunger for a life that was all glittering surface. Julian, the chemist, methodically organized the chaos, creating a clear, chronological archive of Richard's life. He was the anchor, providing a calm, logical structure to the emotional storm. And Agnes, the alchemist, simply listened. She watched Maya's anger and grief slowly transform into a complex, sorrowful understanding. She watched her own daughter, through this painful act of confession, finally, truly, liberate herself from the last shackles of her past. On the final day, they found a small, locked metal box at the very back of the unit. Inside was not another contract, but a single, antique perfume bottle, its glass stopper sealed with wax. Attached was a yellowed tag, the handwriting unmistakably Richard's. It read, For Isabel, the only real thing I ever built. Isabel's hands trembled as she took the bottle. It was a custom fragrance Agnes had created for her years ago, for her 21st birthday. A bright, joyful scent of white florals and citrus. A scent from a time before ambition had curdled her soul. He had kept it. Through all the bankruptcies, the moves, the chaos, he had kept this one small, beautiful thing. In that moment, Richard Thorne was no longer a monster. He was just a man. A broken, tragic man who had lost his way and had held onto one single, fragrant memory of a time when things had been simpler, purer. Maya looked at the bottle, then at Isabel's tear-streaked face. He loved you, she said, her voice soft with a sudden, profound understanding. In his own broken way, he loved you. They did not destroy the archive. At Maya's request, it was quietly donated under a strict seal for 50 years to a university business school library, a case study for future generations on the ethics of ambition. When the three of them returned to Whispering Pines, something had fundamentally shifted. The last ghost had been faced. The last thread had been woven in. Their story was no longer a beautiful facade with an ugly secret. It was whole. Scarred, complex, and true, that evening Agnes went into her laboratory. She took a bottle of Ethuria. With a steady hand, she added one last, final ingredient. It was a single, synthetic molecule Julian had recently created. A molecule that had no scent of its own, but had the unique property of magnifying and brightening the floral heart notes of any composition. It was a molecule of pure, unadulterated joy. She placed the newly modified bottle on the mantelpiece in the living room of the main house. It was no longer just her story. It was theirs, a testament to the fact that true alchemy was not about turning lead into gold. It was about taking the most broken, painful parts of a life and transforming them into a future that was, against all odds, filled with light. 3 years later, the world, having been told their story, did not turn away. It drew closer. The Pritzker Prize and the subsequent wave of international acclaim had transformed the Winter family and their institute from a quiet success story into a global phenomenon. The sensory library was no longer just a destination for architects and perfumers. It was a pilgrimage site for artists, scientists, philosophers, and seekers of all kinds. They came not just to experience the architecture or the scents, but to breathe the air of a place built on the foundations of a profound human story. Life within the Institute settled into a rhythm of deep, focused, and joyful work. The family, having faced and integrated the last ghost of their past, had achieved a state of grace that was both hard-won and profoundly peaceful. Mark, now simply Julian, had become a quiet master in his own right, the head of a research department that was making breakthroughs in sustainable chemistry that had applications far beyond perfumery. His work was his meditation, a daily conversation with his father's legacy and his own redeemed soul. Isabel, as the chief curator and director of the library, had found her true calling. She was a storyteller, using the vast, silent language of scent and space to create exhibitions that were less academic and more like immersive, emotional journeys. She was no longer building structures of glass and steel, but vessels for human experience. The brittle insecurity of her past had been replaced by a calm, grounded confidence. She had, in the most literal sense, built her own sanctuary. Agnes, the matriarch, had become the quiet, gravitational center of their world. She had stepped back from the day-to-day operations, entrusting the future of the Institute to her children. She spent her days in her private laboratory, not driven by ambition, but by a pure, unadulterated curiosity. She was a teacher, a mentor to a select few, and the keeper of the Institute's soul. The family was a functioning, harmonious whole, a perfectly balanced accord. But such perfect harmony is a rare and precious thing. And in the world of commerce, it is often seen not as a state to be admired, but as an asset to be acquired. The first tremor came in the form of an email, addressed personally to Agnes. It was from the office of Lucien Devereux, the legendary CEO of Luxa Global, the largest and most powerful luxury conglomerate in the world. Luxa owned everything from haute couture fashion houses and ancient Swiss watchmakers to five-star hotel chains and champagne vineyards. Devereux was not a businessman. He was a collector of legacies, a man who bought history and sold it back to the world at a staggering markup. He requested a private meeting. The family convened in Agnes's lab, the same room where they had faced every crisis. The mood was somber. The name Devereux was a storm cloud on their peaceful horizon. "We should ignore it," Julian said immediately, his voice sharp and defensive. His transformation had instilled in him a fierce, almost monastic protectiveness of their work's purity. There is nothing that man can offer us. He doesn't build, he consumes. He would take what we've made and turn it into a product, a line item on a quarterly report. Isabel was more contemplative. She traced the rim of a glass beaker with her finger. To ignore a man like Lucien Devereux is a statement in itself. A hostile one. He isn't someone who takes no for an answer. Perhaps it's better to hear him out, to understand his intentions, and to politely, firmly decline. Agnes, who had been studying the email, looked up. Her expression was calm, her eyes clear. Isabel is right. One does not build a fortress by pretending the world outside does not exist. We will meet him, we will listen, and we will be prepared. Lucien Devereux arrived a week later. He was not the brash, arrogant tycoon they might have expected. He was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed, with the quiet, observant eyes of a chess grandmaster and a disarmingly gentle voice. He did not come with a phalanx of lawyers. He came alone. He did not begin with business. He asked Isabel for a personal tour of the sensory library. He walked through the soaring atrium, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone floors. He listened intently as Isabel explained the architectural philosophy, the way the light was designed to shift throughout the day. He stood before the scent archives, the 10,000 vials of history, not with the acquisitive gaze of a collector, but with what appeared to be genuine reverence. Extraordinary, he murmured, his voice resonating in the quiet space. You have not built a museum, Miss Winter. You have built a cathedral. They met in a private conference room, the three of them on one side of a large oak table, Devereux on the other. He did not present a binder or a PowerPoint. He simply began to speak. I have followed your story for some time, he began, his gaze moving between the three of them. The world sees a story of redemption. I see a story of alchemy. A story of transforming the base materials of pain and failure into something of pure, undeniable value. It is the most powerful brand story of the 21st century. And it is being wasted. Julian stiffened, but Devereux held up a placating hand. Please allow me to explain. You have created something exquisite, something pure. Sanctuary is, by all accounts, a masterpiece. The Institute is a beacon of integrity. The library is a work of genius. But it is all contained. It is a secret whispered among the elite. My proposition is simple. I want to take your story, your philosophy, your genius, and give it to the world. His proposal was as brilliant as it was insidious. Luxa Global would not simply buy the Institute. They would partner with it. They would create a new, co-branded entity, Etheria by Luxa. They would pour hundreds of millions of dollars into a global expansion. They would build sister sensory libraries in Shanghai, Dubai, and New York. They would fund Julian's research on a scale he could only dream of. They would launch a commercial, accessible line of fragrances based on the Institute's principles, making the Etheria philosophy available to millions, not just the privileged few who could travel to Grasse. And your family's story, Devereux concluded, his voice a seductive whisper, will be our guiding light. We will not hide it. We will celebrate it. It will be the heart of our global marketing campaign. The story of a family that turned betrayal into beauty. It is the most authentic narrative in the world of luxury today. You will not be selling products. You will be selling hope. He named a number for the initial investment, a figure so vast it seemed to suck the air from the room. He wasn't just offering them wealth. He was offering them a global platform, a chance to spread their vision across the entire planet. He was offering them immortality. After he left, a heavy silence descended upon the room. The temptation was a palpable, living thing. It was Isabel who spoke first, her voice a thoughtful, troubled murmur. He's not wrong, you know. There is an element of elitism in what we've built. This beauty, this peace, we keep it here for the few who can find us. Don't we have a responsibility to share it more broadly? What if we could build a library like this in a city where children have never seen a garden? Isn't that a greater good? Julian's reaction was visceral. It's a poisoned chalice, Isabel, don't you see it? He used the word brand. He used the word marketing. The moment we sign that contract, this stops being a sanctuary and starts being a focus-grouped, market-tested commodity. They won't be selling sanctuary. They'll be selling a cheapened, mass-produced version of it in a bottle designed by a committee, with our faces on the box. They will take our story, our pain, and turn it into a tagline. It is the most vulgar form of prostitution I can imagine. The argument that followed was the first real conflict they had had in years. It was not the bitter, personal conflict of their past, but a passionate, philosophical debate about the very soul of their life's work. Isabel argued for reach, for democratization, for impact. Julian argued for purity, for integrity, for the sanctity of their creation. They were at an impasse, two irresistible forces meeting an immovable object. They both looked to their mother. Agnes had remained silent, her eyes closed, listening. She was the alchemist, and this was the most complex formula they had ever faced: legacy versus reach, purity versus impact. She finally opened her eyes. "There is a principle in perfumery," she began, her voice cutting through the tension. "It is called the accord. An accord is a blend of several notes that, when combined, create a completely new, unique scent that is more than the sum of its parts. Our family now is a balanced accord. It works." She looked at Isabel. "You are right, the desire to share beauty is a noble one. It is the heart note of what we do. It provides warmth, emotion, reach." Then she looked at Julian. "And you are right, the need to protect the integrity of the creation is essential. It is the base note. It provides structure, depth, and longevity. Without it, the heart notes would evaporate into nothing." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens her husband had planted so many years ago. Devereux is a master of top notes. He creates a brilliant, dazzling first impression, but he has no heart and no base. His proposal would be like adding a loud, synthetic chemical to a delicate, natural composition. It would overwhelm everything. It would not be an expansion, it would be a replacement. She turned back to them, her decision made, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable authority. "We will decline his offer, but we will learn from it. Isabel, your desire for reach is valid. We will not partner with Luxa. Instead, we will establish a new, independent foundation, a sensory arts fund. We will use our own profits to fund smaller, community-based projects around the world: scent gardens for hospitals, olfactory programs for schools, architectural scholarships. We will not replicate our library. We will instead give others the seeds to grow their own." It was a solution of breathtaking wisdom. It honored Isabel's ambition and Julian's integrity. It was not a compromise. It was a synthesis, a new, more evolved expression of their mission. The final meeting with Lucien Devereux took place in Agnes's private lab. They laid out their decision, their plan for the new foundation. Devereux listened, his polite smile never faltering, but a flicker of genuine surprise, and perhaps a sliver of respect in his eyes. He had come to acquire an asset, and he had found something he could not buy: a purpose. "A regrettable decision," he said smoothly, rising to leave, "but a fascinating one. Before you go, Mr. Devereux," Agnes said, "a gift." She handed him a small, simple, unlabeled bottle. It was a vial of ethuria. "This cannot be bought," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It cannot be mass-produced. Its formula is intrinsically tied to a specific time, a specific place, and a specific, painful history. To replicate it would be to lie. This is not a product, it is a memory, and a memory can only be shared, not sold." Devereux took the bottle. He stood for a moment, looking at the three of them: the chemist, the architect, the alchemist, a quiet, unbreachable trinity. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of his defeat. And then he was gone. That evening, the three of them walked through the quiet, fragrant gardens of the Institute as dusk settled over the hills of grass. The crisis had passed. They had faced the ultimate temptation, the temptation of their own story packaged for global consumption, and they had chosen a different path. They had chosen not to be a brand, but to be a source. They had chosen not to sell their past, but to use it to fund the future of others. Agnes stopped by a bed of late-blooming roses, their scent rich and complex in the cool evening air. She looked at her children, at the two remarkable, resilient, and finally, whole individuals who stood beside her. The accord of their family was no longer just balanced. It was complete. It had found its final, perfect note. And it was a note not of victory or of peace, but of a quiet, enduring, and infinitely generative purpose. Their work had just begun.